So we're doing kind of a two-screen thing here because it turns out I can't save these videos anywhere but in the event. Hello. My name is Dam Kinnell, the library. Modernly, that's Claire Knutson Lada. I live in the Principality of Ortha in the Kingdom of the West, and I was supposed to be at Gulf Wars this week. But then somebody decided to, reenact the 14th century a little too hard. So keep that in mind when you think about which period you want to do. Early period is the jam. Anyway, so what I'm here to talk to you about is Joys of the Hall. Joys of the Hall is sort of a broad concept. It's going to take us a little while to get through all of this. There's a lot of material. Um, there's a link to the handout, which I completely recommend. It's about 45 pages. Joys of the Hall, though, what we're talking about here is the Hall culture in early Germanic society. We're talking about the Vikings, Anglo-Saxons, but also looking at continental sources. So the continental Saxons, a little bit of the Franks, maybe. Not so much the Goths because they didn't really leave us any information about their lives. We will even look a little bit at the Germania history, but frankly, that's kind of a mess. So we're not going to get much into that. A caveat: this is not touching my face has gotten very difficult. So two caveats, I guess. First caveat is this is only the second time that I've ever taught to a screen. The first time was an hour ago. So we're still working on getting comfortable talking to a little green dot and not to actual human beings. Also sitting and not up and moving. Second caveat, this class is based largely, almost exclusively on written sources. Those written sources are largely written down by unreliable narrators, so your mileage may vary. These are people largely writing well after the events that they're describing, because the Vikings didn't write shit down. And it's sort of being written with various reasons. Like there's various sort of there's a word that I'm blanking on, that you need to keep in mind kind of as you review the sources. The biggest person that I consider a violator of this is Saxo Grammaticus Spit, because he was writing propaganda for the Danish king, and he knew he was right. Like that was his thing. He was writing propaganda. It was not this is a serious history in which I will consider my own biases. No, this was he wanted a story for the Danish bishops, I guess, that he was working for. So you need to keep that in mind when you're reviewing these sources. That honestly, this may all be nonsense. Like this may not at all reflect the lives of people in before the coming of Christianity in the East, or before, frankly, before the Norman invasion in the West. So that's your caveat. And now that we've said that, now that I've made sure that you are aware that this could all be bunk, let us get into it. Huercom mearc, huercom mago, huercom mathum yufa, huercom sumbla yisetu, huer sindon ciela dreamas, eala beort bura, eala burnwiga, eala theodna strum, hu seo thrag hioat, yenap und nicht helm swaheo no wara. So where's the horse? Where's the rider? Where's the giver of treasure? Or if you're Tolkien, where's the horn that was blowing? Where are the seats at the feast? Where are the joys of the hall? They have gone before. Alas for the bright cup, alas the mailed warrior, alas for the splendor of the prince. How that time has passed away under the dark helm of night, as if it had never been. So that's where the title of this class is coming from, and that kind of gives you a vision, at least for an Anglo-Saxon perspective, what the joys of the hall were: the bright cup, the mailed warrior, the splendor of the prince. That's the vision I want you to hold in your mind. So what is the purpose of all this? What is the purpose of feasting? In many early societies, or even modern societies that practice ritual feasting, it's about not only demonstration of wealth, but sharing wealth. So the Laxdala saga, and you'll note throughout the handout that I've tried tried to stick to the either the original name of the piece, the Icelandic name in the case of the sagas, or sort of an agreed upon scholarly name. If you're looking for a concordance of those names to sort of modern names, look at towards the very end. There's a long list of the sources that I've used, the primary sources, and those give you both the either historical or foreign language name and a well agreed upon modern English translation. So Laxdæla Saga, he, Thorkel, hosted a Yule drinking feast at Helgafell, and a large number of people attended. He showed great magnificence with everyone that winter. Gudrun did not resist this and said, that is what wealth is for, to increase prestige, and the resources should be made available that Gudrun needed to make an extravagant display. So the idea here is that the whole point of throwing a feast is to increase your prestige, to demonstrate to everybody around that you have the resources to produce something like this. And what you're getting with that is you're getting influence. So you've demonstrated your wealth or your power through a demonstration of your resources, and that will get you in return respect. It might get you favors if you invite people to your feast. They might be like, you know what, I got this cool invitation, and now I feel really special. Now I owe this person a favor. There's another theory that says, especially in Iceland, if a Gothi, which was a regional power holder, through a feast and various free farmers attended, that was a way for the free farmer to indicate that he supported the Gothi or in some way was sort of throwing his lot in with the Gothi. So if there was intra-island conflict, that he might support that individual over others. So there's an Arabic concept, wasta, which is, for reasons that we don't need to get into, something that my family throws around every so often. And this is a really good analogy. So wasta is basically your connections, the people you know, the influence you can exert. And it's obviously it's not a Norse term, but it's a very similar concept to what we're getting to. It also has to do with the social structure, as we'll discuss later. There is a very, to the best of our knowledge, there's a sort of a delineation of who's who in the feast, and that helped reinforce the social structure around you. It might demonstrate somebody's increase in status or decrease in status, and the feast was a room to be able to do that in. There's a little bit in the handout talking about patron role feasts that I'm not going to get into a whole lot, mostly because I haven't spent a lot of time in the anthropology of feasting outside of this handout, and I feel like I'd be doing you guys a disservice by trying to explain some of these concepts that I might not understand entirely. But I do encourage you to take a look at the Zori article. It's in there's a section at the end of all my resources. Take a look at that. It's actually a fascinating piece. And then fun and entertainment. As we are all about to experience, cabin fever is a thing, and it's terrible. So I live, as I said, the Principality of Ortha. Modernly, that's the state of Alaska. Very familiar with the concept of the sort of the February blues, and just you're done with everybody you've spent time with. And happily, I don't live in a situation where it's me and everybody sort of in one room, or one suite of rooms, which is like, if you take a look at some of the Icelandic farmhouses as an example, there's not a lot of privacy. So you figure you guys are basically inside hanging out together for 2 months. There comes a point where you want to see new faces, and you want to talk to your neighbor from down the valley and not talk to your sibling or spouse or whatever. So feasts are good for that. It's a chance to get together, to celebrate together. It's, a lot of why we do the SCA. So that's another purpose for the feast. And then, so you had rituals. So that's like a social feast, right? So that's not necessarily a ritual environment. That's just, you're getting together to see your friends. Totally cool. The other option is a ritual feast. A ritual feast would be held at specific times of the year traditionally. And it's not just about building that influence, building the connections, but it's also about recognizing a religious or otherwise ritual sort of moment in time. So there's a really good example. They talk Njal Saga, Brennu Njal saga is the Icelandic name. There, some of the feasts discussed there are almost entirely ritual in nature. I'm sorry, I misread my handout. So Brennel, the saga in the feasts in Burnt Njal sagas are about building alliances. Some of the feasts, especially the ones described in the saga of Hakon the Good, is almost strictly ritual in nature. And it does sometimes, you'll see like a blending of these two. So a ritual feast might also contain social elements or vice versa, but you've got sort of a spectrum, right? You've got completely social and completely ritual. So in the middle somewhere you might have a wedding feast, which has ritual components, but also is all about celebrating the couple getting married, their families, introducing, across, building alliances, etc. One thing to think about is we're going to discuss later the idea of women at the feast and the role that women played in a feast. Especially the Yule feast described in the saga of Hakon the Good. I'm not entirely convinced that women were involved in some of the ritual feasting. I feel there's evidence for some pretty strict gender roles in Viking Age society, and a sort of separation of genders. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the twin drinking and stuff like that. We'll talk about that later, but there's some of this particularly the high ritual events that are described in the sagas. I don't know that women would have participated in those. I do think, though, that likely if there was male-only rituals, that there was likely female-only rituals that we don't have record of in the sagas because they're being written by men who may or may not be aware of what's going on. So I talk a little bit more about that in the handout, but just as an FYI. So when I talked earlier about sort of a stratification and the feast as a representation of society, one of the ways that this is best demonstrated is the seating arrangements at the feast. So if you've been somewhere like Stong in Iceland where you have the reconstructed farmhouse, it's basically like a long row like this, and there's sort of these two little huts in the middle, and that was the sleeping chamber, hanging out chamber for the. On the one side, it's the lord of the manor essentially, and the other side is the next best person. So seating happens at the feast. Let me get my brain. So the Harvarthar saga, Ísfirðings, provides a pretty typical arrival and seating scene. The newcomers come to the hall, they introduce themselves, and are directed to a seat according to their station, by the person in charge of the feast. So you would come in, introduce yourself, I'm Kunahild Kunnasigisdottir, and the person at the high seat would then say, please sit here, or there's a great scene in Beowulf where seats are cleared on the benches for Beowulf and his men to sit together. Orning states that the seating order at feasts was an extremely sensitive affair. So if I came to the lord of the head of the feast, the high seat, and I said, I'm Kunahild Kunnasigisdottir, Laurel and Pelican, Pure of the West. A little weird, sure, but that's who I am. And he said, feel free to sit far at the end of the bench, well away from me. I might be pretty insulted, and that would be a reason for me to pick a fight with somebody. Alternatively, if he said, please sit next to me, I'd be like, that's not my seat. This is, and it's another, I don't want to say another opportunity to be insulted, but it's sort of an opportunity for a misstep, right? So if he said, please, sit next to me, and if I know that's not where I belong in the hall, I'd wonder, is he trying to make me look bad? Is he trying to make me look silly? There's a couple examples of this in the sagas, where you're either seated above or below your perceived station, and it's considered an insult. And then, naturally, badness follows. If you look in the handout, there's a pretty long chunk out of Burnt Njal's saga where somebody is sat in the wrong spot and proceeds to take it poorly. and another one of the sagas, the Altsvena saga, it's asked Father, he says, where shall I sit? Father, he said, shall I arrange the seating of the men by rank or by bravery? So that's another option in terms of how seating could be arranged. So not just necessarily their perceived rank in society. Iceland gets a bit tricky because, especially before it comes under Norwegian rule, Iceland is theoretically governed by free farmers. So how do you rank farmers that are of equal rank? Essentially, I mean, you have your regional power holders, but then under them. So here he says, should I rank them by rank or by bravery? Another option is by gender. So there's in Burnt Njal Saga, the women sit together. So it's all women in one area, and then the men sit out everywhere else. Or by age. In Svarfdala Saga, they break them up by age groups. Another good example of that is in Beowulf, when he sat with the other young men. So you have the young men kind of hanging out together and the old men. Earlier I mentioned partner drinking or twin drinking. That's Tvennemegger. I'm, by the way, going to butcher all the Old Norse in here, and I apologize. So partner drinking appears to be a solely Norse practice. I could not find any reference to it in any of the other sources, so it doesn't show up in any of the Anglo-Saxon stuff. And then the sources that I was able to find for continental practices get real tricky. Though there is one really good one that I completely recommend, which is the Saxon Gospel, Heiland, which is a translation largely available in prose translations, but if you're lucky, you can find a poetic translation. It's an epic poem, epic poem that's a translation into Saxon of the gospel story, of the gospel narratives. So they're taking the idea of, Christ and his followers and everything, and they're taking that and they're casting it as a heroic warrior poem. So at one point he goes out and chooses his warrior companions, his Yasith. It's pretty cool. Anyway, they talk a little bit about feasting in there. So that was where I was looking a lot for continental examples, and could not find anything about this partner drinking. So basically with partner drinking, what it appears to be is if you had a lot of men showing up for a feast, especially maybe like a ship's crew or something like that, where you had a lot of guys and not necessarily an equal number of women, they would draw by lots. And so each woman would be sort of randomly assigned to a man, and that was who she was supposed to hang out with for the feast. And none of them really get into whether or not there was an expectation of a sexual relationship following that. I assume they probably did, but you don't know. So basically you draw lots. Any extra men, if there weren't enough women to go around, the extra men would be expected to sit by themselves. The women were only supposed to flirt with the person that they were drinking with. They were only supposed to talk to the person they're drinking with. And the theory here was that it was going to prevent the men from fighting over the women. How well that worked, I don't know. It shows up in Egil's Saga. Jokins is one of the primary sources I looked at or not primary. It's one of the major sources I looked at for women's lives in the Viking Age. She postulates that this was to prevent trouble over women, that they were assigned by lot and any extraneous men were left to drink by themselves. Important men were assigned exclusive company of a girl who was not supposed to flirt with other men, and she doesn't speculate whether or not sexual activity followed. So the choice in the seats, now that we've talked kind of about where you might be assigned by rank, by bravery, by gender, by age, kind of what were your seating options? The best seat was the high seat, and this is primarily, again, Norse information. We do know that it probably was closely mirrored in Anglo-Saxon England, and honestly likely on the continent, though the continent got pretty excited about Imperial Rome, or the end of Imperial Rome, but the rise of sort of the Frankish Empire, they got pretty excited about copying Roman practices. So my guess is that this sort of seating style existed more in Scandinavia and England and less on the continent. So you have in the hall, you think about the hall as long long tables like this, and you've got your high seat. There's some examples where it's described, the high seat is being described as in the middle of the room, which is a weird placement to me, especially if you're in a society where you're concerned about maybe somebody drawing on you. Sitting in the middle of the room where your back is to half the room, that would make me uncomfortable. And I'm wondering if what was meant there was it was in the middle of one of those long benches, which is where, like, again, the stone farmhouse places their high seat. It's in Scandinavia, central Scandinavia. It's largely the high seat is associated with nobility. In Icelandic, when it's the story is set in Iceland, it's the Gothi or rich farmers. Except once it comes under the Kingdom of Norway, it becomes sort of the king's seat. And whether or not it's exclusively the right of the king to sit there, or it's the king's seat, but sometimes other people sit there, I'm a little unclear on. Reconstructed farmhouses, it's in the center, probably on the right-hand bench. In later literature, it's placed on a dais, so not only is it in the center, but it's elevated. The opposite seat is, so you have the high seat is the most important person. The seat opposite from the high seat is the next most important person. So when Egil comes to the King of Norway and is introduced to the King of Norway invites him to sit across from him in the hall, which is very elevated place to sit, and is indication of great honor. So he sits there and then proclaims some poetry, because that's basically what Egil does. Is he shows up, he gets drunk, he proclaims poetry, starts a fight, and leaves. So if the high seat was in Iceland, if the high seat was reserved for royalty, then the opposite seat was for the next highest person, the seat opposite was for the highest honor in the hall. It's sometimes described as decorated with posts. So whether that means that the seat itself was somehow connected into the hall, or it just had large posts on it, is a little unclear. Both seats in Old Norse can be referred to as onvegi, which doesn't help anything at all. But those are your number ones. And then you have your brekker or your paller, your benches that are coming out next to those seats, and that's where the majority of the feast attendees will sit. And you're essentially saying, if the high seat in the middle is the place of most honor, as you move out from the high seat, the honor decreases. So to be invited to sit at one of the near benches is a lot of prestige. As you get out towards the edges of the benches, you're seated at the benches at the table, but the honor that you are being shown is increasingly less the farther you get away. But you're not sitting on the floor, which was the worst place to sit. And there's a great story in Hrolf Kraki's saga, where somebody is seated on the floor, and because he's considered a coward and a villain, and they throw bones to him and all this kind of stuff. And only after he manages to drink the blood of a dragon is he allowed to sit on the benches. So he has fallen so far that they're sitting on the floor, they're treating him as a dog, and he has to defeat a dragon and drink its blood before he's allowed to sit on the benches again. Presumably, at that point, he's allowed to sit on one of the near benches, but it's unclear. So, we've done benches, we've done seating. Before we get, I guess we'll do feasting halls and archaeology, and then we'll take a little break for questions. So we do happily, this is one of the few archaeological things we'll talk about, happily we do have evidence for these halls. There's a number of them in Scandinavia and England, so